She was a virgin secretary hiding her heart, and the millionaire lost control over her every smile. Before we explore all the details of this incredible story, tell us where you're following us from and the time. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss a thing, and let's embark on this journey together. She knew she shouldn't be staying this late again, but somehow she always did. The 42nd floor of the Meridian Tower was bathed in the amber glow of city lights, streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows. Joyce Carter sat at her desk, fingers dancing across the keyboard with practiced precision, her dark eyes reflecting the computer screen's blue light. At 25, she had mastered the art of invisibility, moving through the corporate world like a shadow, efficient and unnoticed. The elevator chimed softly in the distance, and Joyce's hands paused mid-sentence. She glanced at the clock, 9:47 p.m. Her heart did that familiar flutter it always did when she heard those measured footsteps approaching. Alexander Hale never announced his presence. He didn't need to. His energy filled any room he entered, commanding attention without demanding it. "Still here, Joyce?" His voice carried that low, controlled tone that made boardroom executives straighten their spines. She looked up from her screen, meeting his steel-gray eyes for exactly 3 seconds, long enough to be respectful, short enough to maintain professional boundaries. "Just finishing the quarterly projections, Mr. Hale. They'll be ready for tomorrow's meeting." Alexander stood in the doorway of his corner office, his tailored charcoal suit still immaculate despite the long day. At 37, he was the kind of man who commanded New York's financial district with quiet authority. No raised voices, no dramatic gestures, just an unwavering presence that made million-dollar deals feel like casual conversations. But Joyce had learned to read the subtle signs others missed. The way his jaw tightened slightly when a deal went south, how his fingers drummed once, just once, against his thigh when he was thinking, the almost imperceptible softening around his eyes when he looked at her work and found it flawless, which it always was. You don't have to stay so late," he said, stepping closer to her desk. "The projections can wait until morning." "I know." Joyce saved her document, the soft click of her mouse unnaturally loud in the quiet office. I like the silence up here. It's peaceful." Alexander's expression shifted, barely noticeable, but Joyce caught it. For a moment, something almost vulnerable flickered across his features. "It is peaceful," he agreed, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. They stood in that quiet space between professional courtesy and something unnamed, the city sprawling endlessly below them. Joyce felt her pulse quicken as she realized he wasn't moving toward his office. Instead, he was studying her with an intensity that made her fidget with her pearl earring, a nervous habit she'd had since childhood. "Joyce," he said, and the way her name sounded in his voice made her stomach flutter. "Do you ever wonder what it would be like to just stop running the race for a while?" The question caught her off guard. In 3 years of working for Alexander Hale, she'd never heard him speak about anything beyond quarterly reports and market projections. This glimpse behind his perfectly constructed facade felt dangerous and thrilling. She began, then stopped. How could she tell him that she'd been running from something her entire life, not towards success, but away from the fear of being truly seen? "Sometimes," she admitted quietly. Alexander nodded slowly, as if her answer confirmed something he'd been thinking. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken possibilities. Joyce could hear her own heartbeat, could smell the subtle cologne that always lingered in his office, cedar and something distinctly him. "I should let you finish your work," he said finally, but he didn't move. "Mr. Hale?" Joyce's voice was barely above a whisper. Are you okay?" The question seemed to surprise them both. Alexander's carefully maintained composure cracked just enough for Joyce to see something raw underneath, loneliness maybe, or a weariness that all his success couldn't cure. "I'm fine, Joyce. I'm always fine." But the words sounded hollow, even to him. As he finally turned toward his office, Joyce felt a strange boldness rise in her chest. "Mr. Hale?" He paused, hand on his office door. "The race will still be there tomorrow," she said softly. "But tonight is just ours." Alexander turned back to look at her, and for a moment, Joyce saw past the CEO, past the millionaire, past all the walls he'd built. She saw a man who was just as afraid of being truly known as she was. "Good night, Joyce," he said, but his voice carried a weight that made it sound like a promise instead of a farewell. After his office door closed, Joyce sat in the quiet darkness, her work forgotten. She pressed her fingertips to her lips, wondering why they felt warm when he'd never even touched her. Outside, Manhattan sparkled like scattered diamonds, but all Joyce could think about was the way Alexander had looked at her, like she was the most fascinating thing in a room full of priceless art. She gathered her things slowly, knowing that tomorrow would bring back the professional masks they both wore so well. But tonight had felt different. Tonight had felt like the beginning of something that could change everything. And as she waited for the elevator, Joyce couldn't shake the feeling that Alexander was still watching her from behind his closed door, wrestling with the same dangerous thoughts that were keeping her heart racing. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, but before stepping inside, Joyce glanced back one more time. A thin line of light still glowed beneath Alexander's office door, and she wondered if he was thinking about her the same way she couldn't stop thinking about him. As the elevator descended toward the lobby, Joyce realized she was smiling for the first time in months. Something had shifted tonight, something subtle but undeniable, and for the first time since she'd started working at Meridian Tower, she was actually looking forward to tomorrow. But she had no idea that 42 floors above her, Alexander Hale was standing at his window, watching her small figure disappear into the New York night, and wondering how his perfectly controlled world had just been turned upside down by a woman who thought she was invisible. What do you think happens when two people who've spent their lives hiding finally start to see each other? Would you have the courage to let someone past your walls? The coffee tasted different that morning, though Joyce couldn't explain why. She sat at her usual corner table in Brewster's Cafe, a tiny place squeezed between a dry cleaner and a bookstore 3 blocks from Meridian Tower. The morning rush swirled around her, construction workers grabbing quick espressos, nurses from Mount Sinai heading to their shifts, college students with paint-stained fingers nursing large lattes. This was her sanctuary, the place where she could just be Joyce, not Mr. Hale's impeccable secretary. But today even her sanctuary felt different. Every time the bell above the door chimed, her heart skipped, wondering if somehow Alexander might walk through, which was ridiculous. Men like Alexander Hale didn't drink coffee in cramped Brooklyn cafes. They had assistants who brought them perfectly temperature-controlled beverages in crystal cups. "You look like someone stole your favorite pen," came a warm voice beside her. Joyce looked up to see Delphine Torres sliding into the opposite chair, her nurse scrubs wrinkled from a 12-hour shift at the hospital. Delphine had been Joyce's closest friend since they'd met in a community college economics class 5 years ago. 2 young women from working-class families determined to build something better. "Long night," Joyce murmured, stirring her coffee absently. Delphine's dark eyes, always too perceptive, studied Joyce's face. The kind of long night that involves spreadsheets, or the kind that involves a certain grey-eyed CEO. Joyce nearly choked on her coffee. Honey, I've known you since you were afraid to raise your hand in class. You've got that look." Delphine leaned forward, lowering her voice. "The same look you had when you told me you were saving yourself for someone special, except now you're glowing like you might have found him." Heat crept up Joyce's neck. Nothing happened, but something shifted. It wasn't a question. Joyce stared into her coffee, watching the cream swirl in lazy spirals. How could she explain that a simple conversation had felt more intimate than anything she'd ever experienced, that the way Alexander had said her name had echoed in her dreams? "He asked me if I ever wanted to stop running the race," Joyce said quietly. Delphine's eyebrows shot up. "Alexander Hale said that. Mr. Ice-Cold Business Machine. He's not cold, Del. Not really." Joyce's voice carried a protectiveness that surprised them both. "He's just careful, like he's protecting something fragile underneath all that control." "And you want to know what he's protecting?" Joyce nodded, then immediately shook her head. "But that's crazy, right? He's Alexander Hale. Stop." Delphine's voice was firm. "Joyce Carter, you are brilliant, beautiful, and worth knowing. Any man would be lucky to have you see him the way you're seeing this one." The bell chimed again, and this time Joyce's heart truly stopped, because walking through the door of Brewster's Cafe, looking impossibly out of place in his $1,000 suit, was Alexander Hale. His eyes swept the cramped interior, clearly searching, until they landed on Joyce. The surprise that flickered across his features was quickly replaced by something that looked almost relieved. "Oh my God," Delphine whispered. "He followed you here." Joyce stood up so quickly she nearly knocked over her chair. Alexander was already moving toward them, navigating between tables with surprising grace for a man who probably hadn't set foot in a place like this in decades. "Joyce," he said, and again, Her name in his voice did things to her pulse that should have been illegal. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "Mr. Hale," she managed, acutely aware that every conversation in the cafe had stopped. "This is unexpected." "I was in the neighborhood," he said, which was obviously a lie since his penthouse was on the Upper East Side. "Mind if I join you?" Delphine was staring between them like she was watching a tennis match. "I'm Delphine," she said, extending her hand with a grin that Joyce recognized as trouble. Joyce's best friend and designated guardian against men with questionable intentions. Alexander's lips twitched, the closest thing to a smile Joyce had ever seen from him. "Alexander Hale. And my intentions are—" He glanced at Joyce, still being determined. The honesty in his voice made Joyce's chest tight. This wasn't the CEO speaking corporate double talk. This was just a man, standing in a Brooklyn cafe, admitting he didn't have all the answers. "I should get going," Delphine said, gathering her things with obvious reluctance. "Early shift tomorrow." She squeezed Joyce's shoulder as she stood. "Call me later. And I mean later tonight, not next week." After Delphine left, Alexander sat down across from Joyce, looking surreal against the chipped formica table. He ordered black coffee from Meredith, the 60-something owner who had clearly recognized him and was trying not to stare. "How did you know I'd be here?" Joyce asked. "I didn't." Alexander wrapped his hands around the ceramic mug Meredith had brought him, studying it like it held secrets. "I was walking, trying to clear my head, and I saw you through the window. You looked—" He paused, searching for words. "You looked like yourself. Not my secretary, not the woman who makes sure my world runs smoothly. Just Joyce." The way he said it made her feel exposed and cherished at the same time. "I've never seen you walk anywhere," she said softly. "I assumed you were always in the car or helicopter or private jet. I walk when I need to think. And lately," he met her eyes, "I've been thinking a lot." The cafe buzzed around them, but Joyce felt like they were in a bubble, separate from the morning rush and the real world. "About what?" Alexander was quiet for so long that Joyce wondered if he'd heard her. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "About why I've spent 12 years building walls and why you make me want to tear them all down." Joyce's breath caught. This was dangerous territory, not just professionally, but emotionally. She'd spent her entire adult life being careful, being safe. But sitting across from Alexander in this tiny cafe, seeing the vulnerability he was trying so hard to hide, she felt reckless for the first time in her life. "Maybe," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Walls aren't meant to last forever." Alexander looked at her like she'd just solved a puzzle he'd been working on for years. "Joyce." "Yes? Would you have dinner with me? Not for business. Not because I'm your boss. Just because I'd like to spend more time with the woman who drinks coffee in Brooklyn cafes and makes me forget why I thought being alone was safer." The question hung between them, heavy with possibility. Joyce thought about Delphine's words, about her own dreams of someone who would see her truly. She thought about the way Alexander's carefully controlled world had cracked open just enough to let her glimpse the man underneath. "Yes," she whispered, and watched something in his eyes kindle to life. But as they sat there, both of them trembling slightly from the magnitude of what they'd just agreed to, neither of them noticed the woman at the corner table, snapping photos with her phone, her press badge partially visible beneath her jacket. Some walls, once they start to crumble, bring everything else down with them. The restaurant Alexander chose wasn't what Joyce expected at all. Instead of some exclusive Manhattan establishment with marble floors and wine lists thicker than novels, he'd picked Rosalinda's, a family-owned Italian place in Little Italy, where the tables wore checkered tablecloths and the walls displayed 3 generations of family photos. The kind of place where the owner's grandmother still made pasta by hand in the back kitchen. Joyce stood outside the restaurant at exactly 7 o'clock, smoothing down her navy dress. The nicest one she owned, bought for her college graduation and worn only twice since. Her hands trembled slightly as she checked her reflection in the window. What was she doing? This morning she'd been Alexander Hale's secretary. Tonight she was... What exactly? "You look beautiful." She turned to find Alexander approaching from down the street, and her breath caught. Gone was the severe business suit. Instead he wore dark jeans and a soft grey sweater that made his eyes look like storm clouds. He looked younger somehow, more human, more reachable. "Thank you," she managed, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "This place is unexpected. My nanny used to bring me here when I was 12, Alexander said, opening the restaurant door for her. Benedetta Rosalinda was the only person who could convince me to eat vegetables." Inside, The warmth enveloped them immediately. The scent of garlic and basil, the soft murmur of conversation, the gentle clink of silverware against plates. A woman in her 60s with flour-dusted hands and kind eyes approached them, her face lighting up when she saw Alexander. "Alessandro," she exclaimed, pulling him into a fierce hug that he returned with surprising tenderness. "Too skinny, as always. Come, come, I have your table ready." Joyce watched this transformation with fascination. The untouchable CEO disappeared entirely as Alexander submitted to being fussed over by this small Italian woman who clearly saw him as the boy he used to be. "Benedetta, this is Joyce," Alexander said, his hand finding the small of Joyce's back with a touch so gentle it sent shivers up her spine. "Joyce, this is Benedetta Rosalinda, who probably knows more of my secrets than anyone else alive." Benedetta studied Joyce with eyes that missed nothing, then smiled warmly. "Ah, finally. Someone who makes you remember how to smile with your whole face." They were seated at a corner table lit by candlelight, intimate without being oppressive. As Benedetta bustled away, promising to feed them properly, Joyce found herself alone with Alexander for the first time outside of work, and the silence felt charged with possibility. "She seems to know you well," Joyce said, unfolding her napkin with careful precision. "She knew my mother." Alexander's voice carried a weight that made Joyce look up sharply. "Before the accident, Benedetta used to say I had my mother's eyes and my father's stubborn chin." This was the most personal information Alexander had ever shared with her. Joyce felt the privilege of it, the trust implicit in his words. "How old were you?" she asked softly. 8. Alexander's fingers traced the rim of his water glass. "Car accident. Black ice on the FDR drive. After that it was just boarding schools and business meetings with my grandfather's lawyers. Benedetta she was the only place that still felt like family." Joyce's heart ached for the boy he must have been, thrust into a world of responsibilities before he'd learned how to be a child. "I'm sorry. Don't be." Alexander met her eyes. "It made me who I am. Taught me that the only person you can truly rely on is yourself." "Is that what you really believe?" The question seemed to surprise him. He was quiet for a long moment, considering. "I used to, but lately—" He paused as Benedetta arrived with wine and a basket of bread that smelled like heaven. "Lately, I'm not sure about anything I used to believe." Benedetta poured their wine with ceremonial seriousness. "The usual for you, Alessandro, and for the beautiful Joyce." "What does he usually order?" Joyce asked, feeling bold. "Osso buco." "Since he was 12 years old, always the same thing." Benedetta's eyes twinkled. "Very predictable, this one." "Then I'll have something different," Joyce said, surprising herself. "Something he's never tried." Alexander raised an eyebrow, amused. "Feeling adventurous? Maybe it's time." After Benedetta left with their orders, Alexander leaned forward. "Tell me something about yourself that has nothing to do with work." Joyce sipped her wine, feeling its warmth spread through her chest. "I collect vintage postcards, the kind people sent from vacations in the 1950s. Wish you were here messages from places I've never been." "Why postcards?" "Because—" Joyce hesitated, then decided on honesty. "Because they're proof that people used to take time to tell someone they were thinking of them, that someone somewhere was worth remembering." Alexander's expression softened. "You have a romantic soul, Joyce Carter. Is that a bad thing?" "In my world, it's revolutionary." Their conversation flowed easier than Joyce had imagined possible. Alexander told her about learning to fly helicopters because he hated being dependent on others for transportation. Joyce shared her dream of traveling to all the places on her vintage postcards. He admitted he'd never seen a sunrise because he was always working. She confessed she'd never been on a date before tonight. "Never?" Alexander's voice was carefully neutral, but his eyes were intense. Joyce felt heat creep up her neck. "I was waiting for someone who would see me. Really see me, not just—" She gestured vaguely at herself. "Joyce." Alexander's voice was soft but urgent. "Look at me." She met his eyes, and the intensity there made her pulse race. "I see you," he said simply. "The way you bite your lip when you're concentrating. How you always take the stairs instead of the elevator when you think no one's watching. The fact that you keep a small cactus on your desk because you're convinced you can't keep anything else alive, but you water it with coffee when you think I'm not looking." Joyce stared at him, stunned. She'd thought she was invisible, but he'd been watching her, noticing her, seeing her all along. "Alexander," she whispered. "I've been fighting this for months," he continued, his voice rough with honesty. "Telling myself it was inappropriate, that I was your boss, that I couldn't complicate your life, But sitting here with you, watching you discover you're brave enough to order something new, he reached across the table, his fingers brushing hers. I don't want to fight it anymore. Joyce felt tears prick her eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of being truly seen by someone who mattered. I don't want you to fight it either, she whispered. Alexander's thumb traced across her knuckles, such a simple touch that sent electricity through her entire body. Joyce, I need you to know something. If we do this, if we step off this cliff together, there's no going back. My life is complicated. There are people who will try to hurt you just to get to me. As if summoned by his words, Joyce's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. She glanced at it, then felt the blood drain from her face. The message contained a photo of them from this morning at Brewster's Cafe, with a single line of text. Alexander Hale's mystery woman. Story breaks tomorrow unless... Joyce's hands started shaking. Alexander noticed immediately, his expression shifting from tender to protective in an instant. What is it? Joyce showed him the phone, watching his face harden into the mask she knew from the boardroom. But this time, his anger wasn't cold. It was fierce, protective. I'm sorry, Joyce whispered, starting to pull her hand away. I should go, I shouldn't have... No. Alexander's grip on her hand tightened. Don't you dare apologize for someone else's cruelty, and don't you dare run from this because of them. He pulled out his own phone, dialing with sharp, efficient movements. Garrison, it's Alexander. I need you to handle something. Tonight. Yes, I know what time it is. The usual fee doubled if this disappears before morning. Joyce watched him work, saw the power he wielded with casual efficiency, and realized she was glimpsing the world she'd be stepping into, a world where their private moments would be currency, where her name would be headlines. Alexander finished his call and looked at her with eyes that were both apologetic and determined. It's handled, he said quietly. But Joyce, this is what I meant. This is what my life looks like. Are you sure you want to be part of it? Joyce looked around the restaurant, at Benedetta laughing with another table, at the photos of families spanning generations, at the simple warmth of a place where love was measured in homemade pasta and gentle teasing. Then she looked back at Alexander, at this man who collected vintage helicopters but had never watched a sunrise, who commanded empires but still came to eat at the same table where his 12-year-old self had found comfort. Yes, she said and meant it. But I have one condition. Alexander raised an eyebrow. Tomorrow morning, Joyce said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was agreeing to, you're going to watch the sunrise with me. Because if we're going to do this, if we're going to step off this cliff together, I want to see you discover something beautiful for the first time, too. Alexander smiled then, not the polite corporate smile she knew, but something radiant and real. It's a deal, Joyce Carter. But I should warn you, once I see that sunrise with you, I'm never going to want to let you go. And as Benedetta arrived with their dinner, Joyce realized she didn't want him to. At 5:30 a.m., Brooklyn Bridge Park was a different world entirely. Joyce pulled her coat tighter as she walked along the waterfront promenade, her breath forming small clouds in the crisp October air. The city that never slept was taking one of its rare moments of quiet, just the gentle lapping of water against the pier and the distant hum of early morning traffic crossing the bridge above. She'd barely slept, replaying every moment of dinner, every word Alexander had spoken, every time his fingers had brushed hers, the way he'd looked at her when she'd suggested watching the sunrise together, like she'd offered him something precious he'd never thought to want. You're early. Joyce turned to find Alexander approaching from the direction of the subway station, and her heart did that familiar skip. He looked completely different from the man who commanded boardrooms in $1,000 suits, dark jeans, a thick wool coat, sneakers that looked like he'd actually walked in them. His hair was slightly mussed from the wind, and there was something almost vulnerable about seeing him like this, human, approachable, real. I couldn't sleep, she admitted as he reached her side. Neither could I. His voice was rough with exhaustion and something else. Anticipation, maybe. I kept thinking about what you said, about discovering something beautiful. They walked in comfortable silence toward the edge of the promenade, where a few early joggers passed by, and an elderly man fed breadcrumbs to hopeful seagulls. Joyce was acutely aware of Alexander beside her, the way he matched his longer stride to hers, how he instinctively moved to the side closest to the water. I have to ask, Joyce said softly, how long has it been since you took the subway? Alexander's laugh was surprised and genuine. Probably 15 years. I'd forgotten how democratic it is. Everyone just trying to get somewhere, all squished together. Did you use a Metro card or your phone? Phone. Though I had to ask a teenager how to make it work. He looked embarrassed. She looked at me like I was ancient. Joyce smiled, picturing Alexander Hale, master of the universe, being schooled by a 16-year-old on public transportation. You're not ancient. You're just insulated. That's a kind way of saying I live in a bubble. They reached a bench facing east across the East River, where Manhattan's skyline rose like a glittering monument to ambition. The sky was still dark, but there was a hint of something lighter on the horizon. "Tell me about your bubble," Joyce said as they sat down. Alexander was quiet for a long moment, his hands clasped between his knees. Penthouse apartment, private elevator, car service everywhere, helicopter when I need to get somewhere faster. I probably speak to more people in board meetings than I do in my actual life. That sounds lonely. I told myself it was efficient. Alexander looked at her, his eyes soft in the dim light. But yes, it's been very lonely. Joyce felt the weight of his admission, the trust it represented. What about friends, family? My grandfather died when I was 25, left me everything, including the responsibility for about 15,000 employees. As for friends, Alexander shrugged. It's hard to know who wants to know you and who wants to know your bank account. Is that why you've been watching me? Because I already knew your bank account and stayed anyway? Alexander turned to face her fully, his expression serious. Joyce, I've been watching you because you're the first person in years who feels real to me. You get frustrated when the printer jams. You bring soup from home in a thermos that's older than I am. You say thank you to the cleaning crew and remember their kids' names. Joyce felt heat rise in her cheeks. Those are just normal things. Not in my world, they're not. Alexander's voice was soft but intense. In my world, everything is performance, everything is calculated. But you just exist, beautifully, authentically, without apology. The sky was beginning to lighten now, deep purple fading to indigo. Joyce could see the faintest suggestion of gold on the horizon. Alexander, she said carefully, what happens after this, after the sunrise? Tomorrow when we're back in the office, what are we then? He was quiet for so long that Joyce started to worry she'd pushed too far, asked too much too soon. But when he spoke, his voice was steady and sure. I don't know, he said honestly. I've never done this before, Joyce. I've never mixed my personal life with my professional life. I've never wanted to. But you want to now? I want you now. The words hung between them, simple and devastating. I want to know what makes you laugh when you think no one's listening. I want to show you places that exist beyond vintage postcards. I want to watch you discover that you're braver than you think, stronger than you know. Joyce's breath caught. And what do you want me to know about you? Alexander looked out at the water, considering. I want you to know that I learned to pilot helicopters because it's the only time I feel completely in control and completely free at the same time. I want you to know that I own 17 restaurants but eat alone most nights. I want you to know that I've built my entire life around being needed rather than wanted. And I'm terrified that if you really knew me, you'd realize there's nothing underneath worth wanting. The vulnerability in his voice broke something open in Joyce's chest. Without thinking, she reached for his hand, threading their fingers together. Alexander, she said softly, I've seen you comfort Benedetta when she was worried about her grandson's surgery. I've seen you quietly pay for the lunch of the homeless veteran who sits outside our building. I've seen you work 18-hour days, not because you love the power, but because you genuinely care about the people whose livelihoods depend on the decisions you make. Alexander stared at their joined hands like he couldn't quite believe they were real. You see too much, he murmured. Maybe you've been seen too little. The sky was definitely lighter now, pale gold bleeding through the indigo. A few early commuters were beginning to appear on the promenade, walking briskly toward the subway station. Joyce, Alexander said suddenly, urgency in his voice, there's something I need you to know before this goes any further. She felt her stomach clench. What? Yesterday, when that photographer threatened to run the story about us, my lawyer Garrison didn't just make it disappear. He found out who was behind it. Joyce's hand tightened in his. Who? Genevieve Ashford. She was someone I was involved with about 2 years ago. It ended badly. She's been looking for ways to hurt me ever since, and apparently, Alexander's jaw tightened. Apparently she decided you were the perfect weapon. Joyce felt cold suddenly, despite Alexander's warm hand in hers. What does that mean? It means she's going to try to make your life difficult. It means there will probably be more photographers, more invasions of privacy. It means stepping into my world comes with a price I never wanted you to have to pay." The sun was starting to show itself now, a brilliant sliver of gold peeking over the horizon. But Joyce barely noticed, her mind reeling with the implications of what Alexander was telling her. "Are you saying I should walk away?" she asked quietly. "I'm saying you should have all the information before you decide to stay." Joyce was quiet, watching the sun slowly emerge from behind the skyline. Around them, the world was waking up. Joggers, dog walkers, commuters hurrying to catch early trains. Normal people living normal lives, unburdened by the complications that seem to follow wealth and power. "Alexander," she said finally, "look at me." He turned, and in the growing light, she could see the fear in his eyes, not of Genevieve Ashford or photographers or complications, but of her walking away. "I grew up in a 2-bedroom apartment in Crown Heights," Joyce said steadily. "My mum worked double shifts at the hospital. My dad drove a city bus for 30 years. I learned early that anything worth having comes with a price, and the question isn't whether you can afford to pay it. The question is whether what you're getting is worth what you're giving up." The sun broke free of the skyline completely now, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink that took Joyce's breath away. Alexander was silhouetted against the light, his face shadowed, but his attention entirely focused on her. "And?" he asked quietly. Joyce looked at this man who had dismantled his carefully constructed world just to sit on a bench and watch the sunrise with her. This man who was offering her honesty instead of protection, truth instead of comfort. "And I think you're worth it," she said simply. Alexander's expression transformed, relief and something deeper flooding his features. He lifted their joined hands to his lips, pressing a soft kiss to her knuckles. "Joyce Carter," he said against her skin, "I think you might be the bravest person I've ever met, or the most foolish. Maybe both. Maybe that's what makes you perfect." As they sat there watching the sun climb higher, painting the water in shades of gold and sending light dancing across the Manhattan skyline, Joyce realized she wasn't afraid anymore. Not of Genevieve Ashford, not of photographers, not of the complications that would surely come. She was afraid of only one thing now, of how much she was already beginning to love this man who thought he was unworthy of being wanted. But as Alexander squeezed her hand and they watched their first sunrise together, Joyce decided that some fears were worth facing, especially when you didn't have to face them alone. Walking into Meridian Tower that Monday morning felt like stepping onto a stage where everyone knew the script except her. Joyce noticed the stares immediately, the way conversations stopped when she passed, the lingering glances from colleagues who had never paid her any attention before. At the security desk, Winston, the guard who had wished her good morning every day for 3 years, looked at her with something that might have been pity. "Morning, Miss Carter," he said quietly, sliding her building pass across the marble counter. You might want to take the express elevator today." Joyce's stomach clenched. "Why?" Winston glanced around nervously, then leaned closer. "There's been some talk, photos. I'm sure it's nothing, but..." He shrugged helplessly. The elevator ride to the 42nd floor felt endless. Joyce stared at her reflection in the polished steel doors, trying to project the same professional confidence she'd worn like armor for 3 years. But underneath, her heart was racing with dread. The executive floor was buzzing with an energy that felt dangerous. Conversations died as she walked to her desk, replaced by the kind of whispers that felt like tiny knife cuts. Joyce sat down at her computer, hands trembling slightly as she logged in, and immediately understood what Winston had been trying to warn her about. Her inbox was flooded with emails, most from addresses she didn't recognize. Subject lines like "saw the photos" and "gold digger much?" and worse things that made her stomach turn. But it was the email from Cordelia Mansfield, Alexander's longtime executive assistant, that made her blood run cold. "Ms. Carter, please see me immediately, CM." Cordelia's office was 3 doors down from Alexander's, a smaller but no less intimidating space filled with expensive art and the kind of understated luxury that screamed old money. Cordelia herself was 60-something, silver-haired, and had been with the company longer than Joyce had been alive. She was also, Joyce had always suspected, deeply protective of Alexander, in a way that went beyond professional duty. "Sit," Cordelia said without preamble, gesturing to the chair across from her desk. Joyce sat, folding her hands in her lap to keep them from shaking. "I assume you've seen the photographs," Cordelia continued, her voice crisp and cold. "What photographs?" Cordelia turned her computer monitor around. On the screen was a gossip website Joyce had never heard of, with a headline that made her feel sick. Billionaire's Brooklyn beauty, Alexander Hale's secret romance exposed. The photos were tastefully invasive. Joyce and Alexander at Brewster's Cafe walking into Rosalinda's, sitting close together on the bench at Brooklyn Bridge Park. The captions were worse than the images, speculating about Joyce's background, her motivations, her convenient position as Alexander's secretary. 27 years I've worked for this company, Cordelia said, her tone sharp enough to cut glass. 27 years of watching ambitious young women try to use their proximity to Mr. Hale for personal gain. Joyce found her voice. It's not like that. Isn't it? Cordelia leaned back in her chair, studying Joyce like a specimen under a microscope. You're 25 years old, from a working-class family in Brooklyn, and suddenly you're having romantic dinners with one of the most powerful men in New York. Forgive me if I find the timing convenient. Heat flashed through Joyce, anger burning away the fear. You don't know anything about me, or about what's happening between Alexander and me. I know that your little romance has already cost this company 3 hours of productivity this morning alone. I know that the phones haven't stopped ringing with reporters wanting comments. I know that Mr. Hale's reputation is none of your business. The voice from the doorway was quiet, but carried the kind of authority that made both women freeze. Alexander stood in the doorway, still in his coat, his face a mask of controlled fury. But his anger wasn't directed at Joyce. Cordelia, he said, his voice dangerously soft, you're dismissed. Mr. Hale, you were only overstepping your bounds in a way that ends now. Alexander stepped into the office, and suddenly the spacious room felt small. Your job is to manage my calendar, not my personal life. Are we clear? Cordelia's face went white, then red. She gathered her things with sharp, efficient movements, shooting Joyce a look that promised this wasn't over. After she left, Alexander closed the door and turned to Joyce, who was still sitting rigid in her chair, trying to process what had just happened. Are you all right? He asked, his voice gentling immediately. Joyce laughed, a sound somewhere between hysteria and disbelief. Am I all right? Alexander, have you seen? She gestured helplessly at the computer screen. He moved around the desk to look at the monitor, his jaw tightening as he read. Garrison assured me he'd handled this. He handled the photographer. Apparently he couldn't handle the entire internet. Alexander was quiet for a long moment, studying the photos. In them, Joyce could see what the rest of the world saw, a young woman who looked completely smitten with a powerful older man. The story wrote itself. Joyce, Alexander said finally, I need you to know that none of this changes anything, Joyce finished softly. I know. He looked at her sharply. Does it change anything for you? Joyce thought about the emails in her inbox, about Cordelia's accusations, about the way her co-workers had looked at her like she was suddenly a different species. She thought about what it would be like to walk into this building every day knowing that everyone was watching, judging, waiting for her to prove them right about her motivations. Yes, she said honestly, it changes everything, but not the way you think. Before Alexander could respond, Joyce's phone buzzed with a text from Delphine. Emergency. Meet me at Brewster's. Now. Joyce showed Alexander the message, and he immediately reached for his coat. I'll drive you. Alexander, you can't. If we're seen together now, Joyce. His voice was firm. We're not hiding. We're not ashamed. And we're certainly not going to let someone else's agenda dictate how we live our lives. The ride to Brooklyn in Alexander's town car was tense and quiet. Joyce stared out the window at the familiar neighborhoods of her childhood, wondering if she was making the biggest mistake of her life. When they pulled up outside Brewster's Cafe, she could see Delphine through the window, pacing like a caged animal. Stay here, Joyce told Alexander. Whatever this is, I need to handle it first. Inside the cafe, Delphine grabbed Joyce's hands before she could even sit down. Joyce, honey, we have a problem. If this is about the photos, it's about your mother. Joyce's blood went cold. What about my mother? Delphine pulled out her phone, showing Joyce a news article with a photo that made her knees weak. It was her mother, Lorraine Carter, standing outside Mount Sinai Hospital in her nurse's scrubs, looking exhausted and overwhelmed as reporters shoved microphones in her face. The headline read, Alexander Hale's girlfriend's mother. I just want them to leave us alone. They've been camped outside the hospital since 6 this morning, Delphine said quietly. Your mum couldn't even get to work without being harassed. Hospital security finally had to escort her through the back entrance. Joyce felt like she was drowning. This was exactly what Alexander had warned her about, but somehow she'd convinced herself it would only affect her. She'd never imagined they would drag her family into it. "There's more," Delphine said gently. "Someone leaked your address. There are photographers outside your apartment building." Mrs. Kowalski from 4B tried to chase them away with a broom, but Joyce closed her eyes, picturing her elderly neighbor defending her building like a tiny Polish warrior. The image would have been funny if it wasn't so horrible. "Joyce," Delphine continued, "you can't go home. Not tonight. Maybe not for a while." Through the cafe window, Joyce could see Alexander in his car, talking urgently on his phone, probably dealing with damage control, crisis management, all the things that came with his world. She thought about her mother's face in that photo. Tired, confused, just trying to do her job and help people, suddenly thrust into a spotlight she never asked for. This was the price. This was what loving Alexander Hale actually cost. Joyce pulled out her phone and called her mother. "Joyce, baby." Lorraine's voice was strained. "Are you okay? I've been so worried. Mom, I'm so sorry. I never meant for this to happen to you." "Honey, what's going on? These reporters, they're asking about some billionaire showing me pictures of you. Joyce, what aren't you telling me?" Joyce looked out at Alexander, who was now standing beside his car, his attention focused entirely on her through the cafe window. Even from this distance, she could see the concern in his posture, the way he was fighting every instinct to come inside and protect her. "Mom," Joyce said softly, "I think I'm falling in love with someone, and it's complicated." There was a long pause. "How complicated?" "The kind that gets you followed by photographers." Another pause, longer this time. Then Lorraine laughed, not the reaction Joyce had expected. "Baby," her mother said warmly, "I've been wondering when someone was going to be brave enough to see what I've been seeing in you for 25 years. The only question is, does he see it too?" Joyce looked at Alexander again, at the way he was standing vigil outside a Brooklyn cafe in his $1,000 coat, waiting for her to need him. "Yeah, Mom," she whispered. "I think he does. Then we'll figure out the rest, we always do." After Joyce hung up, she sat in the warm chaos of Brewster's Cafe, surrounded by the normal sounds of normal people living normal lives, and tried to decide what came next. Through the window, Alexander was still waiting, patient as a statue, ready to catch her if she fell. But for the first time since this all began, Joyce realized she wasn't falling. She was choosing to jump. Alexander's penthouse was nothing like Joyce had imagined. She'd expected cold marble and intimidating art, the kind of space that screamed wealth but whispered loneliness. Instead, she found herself in a home that felt surprisingly warm. Exposed brick walls, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a kitchen that looked actually used. Through the massive windows, Central Park stretched out like a green ocean, but it was the baby grand piano in the corner that caught her attention. "You play?" she asked, running her fingers along the polished wood. "Badly," Alexander said, setting down her overnight bag, hastily packed by Delphine while photographers still camped outside Joyce's building. "My mother insisted on lessons. I kept them up after. It helps me think." Joyce pressed a single key, the note hanging in the air between them. Everything felt surreal. This morning she'd been Alexander Hale's secretary, and now she was standing in his home, officially displaced from her own life by paparazzi and gossip columnists. "Joyce," Alexander said softly, "I need you to know that you don't have to stay here. I can arrange for a hotel or—" "Alexander," she turned to face him, this man who had just upended his entire professional life to defend her in front of his longtime assistant. "Stop." "Stop what?" "Stop giving me exits. Stop making it easy for me to run." Joyce moved closer to him, noting the tension in his shoulders, the careful way he was holding himself apart from her. "I'm here because I chose to be here. Not because I have nowhere else to go, but because this is where I want to be." Alexander's control cracked just enough for her to see the relief underneath. "Joyce, you have no idea what you're walking into. This is just the beginning. Genevieve won't stop with some gossip photos. She'll dig into your past, your family's past. She'll try to find anything she can use to hurt you. Then let her dig." Joyce reached for his hands, noting how they trembled slightly in hers. "Alexander, I'm not made of glass. I'm the daughter of a woman who worked double shifts to put me through college, who taught me that anything worth having is worth fighting for. But you shouldn't have to fight for this. You shouldn't have to pay this price just for what? For falling in love with you?" The words hung in the air between them, more powerful than Joyce had intended. Alexander stared at her, something vulnerable and desperate flickering across his features. "Joyce," he whispered, I know it's too soon to say it, she continued, her voice steady despite the way her heart was racing. I know we've only had 3 real conversations outside of work, but Alexander, I've been watching you for 3 years. I've seen how you treat the custodial staff like family, how you remember everyone's birthdays, how you stayed at the office until midnight helping Tobias from accounting when his daughter needed surgery and the insurance wouldn't cover it. Alexander looked stunned. You noticed that? I notice everything about you. Joyce stepped closer, close enough to see the gold flecks in his grey eyes. And what I've noticed is that you're not the cold businessman everyone thinks you are. You're a man who's been protecting himself for so long that you've forgotten how to let anyone else protect you. Before Alexander could respond, his phone rang. He glanced at it, frowning. Garrison, he answered, putting it on speaker. Tell me you have good news. Some good, some not so good, came the lawyer's voice through the phone. The good news is I've got injunctions in place to keep the photographers at least 50 feet from Joyce's building and her mother's workplace. The bad news is Genevieve is escalating. Joyce felt Alexander's hands tighten in hers. How? Alexander asked. She's given an exclusive interview to Valentina Cross at Metropolitan Magazine. It's hitting newsstands tomorrow, but I got an advance copy. Alex, Garrison's voice was grim. She's painting herself as the victim, claims you used her and discarded her, that you have a pattern of preying on younger, vulnerable women. Joyce watched the color drain from Alexander's face. And Joyce, she's portrayed as the latest in a long line. Ambitious secretary who seduced her boss for money and status. Valentina's a respected journalist, Alex. People will believe her. Alexander closed his eyes, and Joyce could see him retreating behind his walls again, pulling away from her even though they were still touching. There's more, Garrison continued. Genevieve's hired Brennan Kellaway's firm. Who's Brennan Kellaway? Joyce asked. Alexander's jaw tightened. The best crisis management firm in the city, specializes in reputation destruction, which means this is about to get much worse, Garrison added. Alex, I need to ask, is there anything in your past with Genevieve that she could use? Anything that might lend credence to her claims? Alexander was quiet for so long that Joyce began to worry. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. Genevieve and I were together for 8 months. I ended it when I realized she was more interested in being Mrs. Alexander Hale than she was in being with me. She didn't take it well. Define didn't take it well, Garrison pressed. She threatened to hurt herself, said she couldn't live without me. I arranged for her to see someone, a therapist. I thought she'd moved on. Joyce squeezed his hands. Alexander, that's not your fault, isn't it? He looked at her with eyes full of guilt. Maybe Genevieve's right. Maybe I do use people. Maybe I'm exactly the kind of man who takes advantage. Stop. Joyce's voice was sharp enough to cut through his spiral. Alexander Hale, look at me. He met her eyes reluctantly. The man I know spent 3 hours last Christmas Eve personally delivering bonuses to employees who couldn't make it to the office party because they were caring for sick family members. The man I know quietly pays for the coffee of every veteran who comes into the lobby. The man I know just risked everything to defend me in front of someone he's worked with for decades. Joyce? Garrison's voice came through the phone, gentler now. I hate to interrupt, but we need to discuss strategy. This article hits tomorrow, which means we have about 12 hours to get ahead of it. Alexander straightened, slipping back into CEO mode. What do you recommend? We could arrange an interview, get your side of the story out there, show the real Alexander Hale, not the caricature Genevieve's painting. No, the word came out sharper than Alexander intended. I won't put Joyce through that. I won't make her defend our relationship to strangers. Alex, with respect, it might not be your choice anymore. This story is going to run with or without your input. At least this way you control the narrative. Joyce listened to them discuss damage control and media strategy, watching Alexander's face grow more closed off with each passing minute. She could see him building walls in real time, preparing to do what he'd always done, face the world alone. But she had other plans. I'll do it, she said quietly. Both men stopped talking. Joyce, no, Alexander said immediately. I won't let you. Let me. Joyce raised an eyebrow. Alexander, I'm not asking for permission. I'm telling you what's going to happen. If Genevieve wants to make this about me, then I'm going to make sure people know who I really am. Joyce, Garrison's voice was cautious. Media interviews can be brutal. They'll ask invasive questions, try to trip you up. Then I'll tell them the truth. Joyce looked at Alexander, seeing the fear in his eyes, not for himself, but for her. I'll tell them about the man who notices when his secretary brings soup from home and quietly stocks the office kitchen with her favorite tea. I'll tell them about the man who learned my coffee order, not because it was his job, but because he wanted to do something nice for someone who does nice things for everyone else. Alexander stared at her like she was speaking a foreign language. Joyce, you don't understand what you're offering to do. I understand perfectly. Joyce reached up to touch his face, feeling the tension in his jaw. I understand that Genevieve is trying to destroy something beautiful before it has a chance to grow. I understand that you're terrified of letting me fight for us, because you've never had anyone who wanted to fight for you. That's not, isn't it? Joyce's voice was soft but insistent. Alexander, when is the last time someone stood up for you? Not your money, not your company, not your reputation. You. Alexander was quiet, and Joyce could see the answer in his eyes. Never. No one had ever fought for Alexander Hale the man, only for Alexander Hale the brand. Garrison, Joyce said, not taking her eyes off Alexander, set up the interview. But I have conditions. Name them. I want Melody Winters from Channel 7. She's fair, she's thorough, and she won't sensationalize this. And I want it done here, in Alexander's home. If we're going to tell our story, we're going to tell it honestly. Alexander caught her hand, pressing it against his cheek. Joyce, are you sure about this? She looked around his penthouse, at this space that somehow felt more like home than anywhere she'd ever lived, at this man who was still learning how to be loved. I've never been more sure of anything in my life, she said. But Alexander, I need you to promise me something. Anything. Promise me that whatever happens tomorrow, whatever they ask, whatever they say about us, promise me you won't disappear. Promise me you won't decide this is too hard and walk away to protect me. Alexander's eyes filled with something that looked like wonder. Joyce Carter, you are the most extraordinary woman I've ever met. Is that a yes? That's a promise, he said and kissed her palm. Whatever comes next, we face it together. As Garrison hung up to make arrangements and the sun began to set over Central Park, Joyce realized that tomorrow would change everything. Either their story would survive the scrutiny, or it would crumble under the weight of other people's expectations. But tonight, in the quiet of Alexander's home, with his arms finally wrapped around her and her head resting against his chest, Joyce felt something she'd never experienced before. She felt like she was exactly where she belonged. The camera crew arrived at Alexander's penthouse at exactly 9 a.m., transforming his living room into a television studio. Joyce watched from the kitchen as Melody Winters directed the placement of lights and cameras, her silver hair perfectly styled despite the early hour. At 52, Melody had built her reputation on asking hard questions with compassion, never going for the easy sensationalism that made for good ratings but destroyed lives. You don't have to do this, Alexander said for the 10th time that morning, adjusting his navy tie with nervous precision. Joyce smoothed down her emerald dress, borrowed from Delphine, who had arrived at dawn with moral support and a selection of camera-appropriate outfits. Alexander, we've been over this. I'm ready. But as she said it, Joyce's hands trembled slightly. The morning papers had been brutal. Metropolitan magazine's cover story painted her as a calculating opportunist who had seduced her wealthy boss, while Genevieve was portrayed as a heartbroken victim, warning other women about Alexander's predatory pattern. The worst part was how convincing it all sounded when stripped of context and nuance. Joyce, Melody approached, her expression kind but professional. I wanted to go over a few things before we start. Some of these questions are going to be uncomfortable. I'll ask about your relationship timeline, your motivations, your background. The key is to stay calm and tell your truth. Joyce nodded, her mouth suddenly dry. And Mr. Hale, Melody continued, I'll need to ask about Genevieve Ashford's allegations. The audience will expect you to address them directly. Alexander's jaw tightened, but he nodded. I understand. As the crew finished their setup, Joyce excused herself to the bathroom, needing a moment to breathe. Her reflection in the mirror looked calm, professional, nothing like the churning anxiety she felt inside. This interview would be seen by millions of people, all of them judging her, her family, her choices. Her phone buzzed with a text from her mother. Watching today, so proud of you, baby. Show them who you really are. Another from Delphine. Remember, you're not defending yourself. You're sharing your truth. There's a difference. And one from an unknown number that made her blood run cold. Enjoy your 15 minutes. When this is over, you'll have nothing left. G. Joyce deleted Genevieve's message without responding, but the words lingered. When this was over, what would she have left? Her job was complicated now, her privacy was gone, her family had been dragged into something they never asked for. But when she walked back into the living room and saw Alexander waiting for her, his eyes full of quiet support and something deeper, Joyce remembered why she was doing this. "Ready?" Melody asked, settling into her chair across from the sofa where Joyce and Alexander would sit. "Ready," Joyce said, taking Alexander's hand as they sat down together. The interview started gently. Melody asked about Joyce's background, her education, her career path. Joyce found her rhythm, speaking about her childhood in Brooklyn, her parents' work ethic, her pride in earning her position at Meridian Tower through her own merit. "So when did your relationship with Mr. Hale change from professional to personal?" Melody asked. Joyce glanced at Alexander, then back at Melody. "It wasn't sudden. I think we both felt the connection growing over time, but we were both very careful about professional boundaries. The first time we spoke about anything personal was just last week." "Last week?" Melody's eyebrows rose slightly. "So this is a very new relationship?" "The romantic aspect is new," Alexander interjected, his voice steady. "But I've been aware of Joyce as more than just an employee for much longer. She's unlike anyone I've ever met." "In what way?" Alexander looked at Joyce, and she could see him making a choice, to be vulnerable on camera, to let the world see something real. "Joyce sees people," he said simply. "In my world, most interactions are transactional. People want something from me, money, influence, access. But Joyce never asked for anything except the chance to do her job well. She brings coffee to security guards during long shifts. She remembers everyone's children's names. She makes the office feel like a place where human beings work, not just corporate assets." Melody leaned forward. "Ms. Carter, critics are saying that this relationship gives you access to incredible wealth and power. How do you respond to suggestions that your feelings might be influenced by Mr. Hale's financial status?" Joyce had practiced this answer, but sitting under the bright lights, she abandoned her prepared response. "I understand why people might think that," she said honestly. "When someone has as much money as Alexander does, it's easy to assume that's what attracts people to him. But here's what those critics don't know. I fell for Alexander before I knew he noticed me as anything more than his secretary." "Can you explain what you mean?" Joyce took a breath. "There was a day about 6 months ago when our custodial supervisor, Hector, mentioned that his grandson was in the hospital. Alexander didn't just express sympathy, he quietly arranged for the company's best health insurance to cover the entire family, and then he personally visited the hospital. Not for publicity, not for tax benefits. He just did it because it was the right thing to do." She could see Melody's expression softening. "I watched him comfort Hector when the boy was scared about surgery. I saw him sit in a hospital waiting room for 3 hours just to make sure everything went okay. That's when I knew that underneath all the boardroom presentations and million-dollar deals, Alexander was someone worth knowing." "Mr. Hale?" Melody turned to Alexander. "Genevieve Ashford has made some serious allegations about your character. She claims you have a pattern of pursuing younger women in vulnerable positions. How do you respond?" Alexander's hand tightened almost imperceptibly in Joyce's, but his voice remained calm. "Genevieve and I had a relationship that ended badly. I take responsibility for my part in that. I should have been clearer about my expectations from the beginning, and I should have ended things sooner when it became obvious we wanted different things. She claims you used her and discarded her. That's not how I saw it. But I understand that might be how she experienced it." Alexander paused, choosing his words carefully. "Genevieve is a complicated person who deserves happiness. I'm sorry I couldn't be the person to give that to her. But her pain doesn't give her the right to hurt Joyce, who has done nothing except care about someone she thought might care about her in return." Melody's next question was the one Joyce had been dreading. "Miss Carter, there are rumors about your personal experience. Some suggest that your inexperience makes you vulnerable to manipulation by someone as powerful as Mr. Hale." Joyce felt heat creep up her neck, but she met Melody's gaze steadily. "My personal choices are my own," she said quietly. "I've never been ashamed of waiting for someone who would see me as more than a conquest or a convenience. What I find interesting is how my choice to wait is being used to suggest I'm naive, while it's never suggested that maybe I was just selective. And you feel you found that person in Mr. Hale?" Joyce looked at Alexander, at this man who had risked his reputation to defend her, who had opened his home to her, who was sitting here letting the world scrutinize his life because she'd asked him to. "I feel like I found someone worth fighting for," she said simply. The interview continued for another 20 minutes, covering their plans for the future, the media attention, the impact on their work relationship. Through it all, Joyce felt Alexander's steady presence beside her, his quiet strength anchoring her when the questions got too invasive. As the crew packed up their equipment, Melody pulled Joyce aside. "That was beautifully done," she said quietly. "You came across as genuine, thoughtful, and strong. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." After everyone left, Joyce and Alexander sat in the sudden quiet of his living room, the weight of what they'd just done settling over them. "Do you think it will help?" Joyce asked. "I think you were magnificent," Alexander said, pulling her closer on the sofa. "Whatever happens next, people saw who you really are today." Joyce's phone buzzed with notifications, social media mentions, text messages, missed calls. The world was already reacting to their interview, but for the first time since this all began, Joyce wasn't afraid to look. Because sitting in Alexander's arms, she realized something important. She didn't need the world's approval anymore. She had something more valuable than that. She had someone who saw her completely and loved her anyway. "Alexander," she said softly, "whatever the reaction is, I want you to know, I don't regret any of this. Even if it costs you everything." Joyce thought about her old life, the careful boundaries, the safe choices, the quiet, invisible existence she'd built to protect herself from being hurt. "Especially then," she whispered, "because what we have, it's worth more than everything I thought I wanted to protect." And as New York City buzzed with opinions about their love story, Joyce Carter finally understood what it meant to be brave. The interview changed everything, but not in the way Joyce expected. 3 days after it aired, she sat in Alexander's home office, scrolling through social media reactions while he worked on his laptop across from her. The responses were split. Some people saw exactly what Joyce had hoped they would see, calling her genuine and brave. Others remained convinced she was a gold digger with excellent acting skills. But it was the message from Cordelia Mansfield that morning that had truly surprised her. "I owe you an apology," the email read. "After watching your interview, I realize I misjudged both your character and your intentions. Mr. Hale is lucky to have someone willing to fight for him the way you did. If you'll have me, I'd like to help make your transition back to the office as smooth as possible. CM." "Alexander," Joyce said, turning her laptop screen toward him. "Have you seen this?" He read Cordelia's message, his eyebrows rising. Cordelia Mansfield apologizing is rarer than a solar eclipse. She must have been genuinely moved by your interview. Before Joyce could respond, Alexander's phone rang. Garrison's name flashed on the screen. "Please tell me you have good news," Alexander answered. "Better than good." Garrison's voice was triumphant. "The story's shifting. Genevieve's credibility is crumbling." Joyce felt her heart skip. "What do you mean?" "3 of Genevieve's former assistants came forward after your interview. Apparently your grace under pressure inspired them to speak their truth. They're describing a pattern of erratic behavior, manipulation tactics, even some illegal activities related to insider trading that happened during her relationship with Alex." Alexander sat back in his chair, stunned. "Insider trading?" "She was using information she gleaned from your conversations to make stock purchases through shell companies. We're talking serious federal crimes, Alex. The FBI is now involved." Joyce felt dizzy. "The FBI? It gets better," Garrison continued. "Brennan Kellaway's firm just dropped her as a client. Apparently, when they did their due diligence for the reputation campaign, they uncovered things that made them very nervous. They've sent all their files to federal investigators." Alexander reached for Joyce's hand. "So what does this mean for us?" "It means the narrative has completely flipped. Genevieve went from victim to villain overnight. The same publications that ran her story are now running exposés about her business practices. Joyce, your interview didn't just defend your relationship, it accidentally brought down a woman who's been committing financial crimes for years." After Garrison hung up, Joyce and Alexander sat in stunned silence. "I never wanted to hurt her," Joyce said quietly. "I just wanted people to see who we really are." "Joyce," Alexander pulled his chair closer to hers, "you didn't hurt Genevieve. Her own choices did that. All you did was tell the truth with such authenticity that it inspired other people to tell theirs." Joyce's phone buzzed with a text from Delphine. "Girl, turn on Channel 7. Now." They rushed to the living room, where Melody Winters was delivering a breaking news report. "Federal authorities have arrested socialite Genevieve Ashford on charges of securities fraud and insider trading," Melody announced. "The investigation began after several former employees came forward, following our exclusive interview with Joyce Carter and Alexander Hale. Ms. Ashford's recent allegations against the couple now appear to have been part of a calculated campaign to discredit potential witnesses to her financial crimes. Joyce sank onto the sofa, overwhelmed. Alexander, this is insane. 3 days ago, we were the scandal. Now what are we? Free, Alexander said simply, sitting beside her. For the first time in weeks, we're free to just be us. But even as he said it, Joyce could see something troubled in his expression. What's wrong? She asked. Alexander was quiet for a long moment. Joyce, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Her stomach clenched. Okay. Are you staying with me because you love me? Or because everything else in your life has been turned upside down, and I'm the only stable thing left? The question hit Joyce like a physical blow. Alexander, how can you ask me that? Because I've been thinking about what you've sacrificed. Your privacy, your normal life, your ability to just exist without being watched and judged. And I'm terrified that when the dust settles, when your life goes back to normal, you're going to realize that what you thought was love was actually just trauma bonding. Joyce stared at him, seeing the fear he was trying so hard to hide. Is that really what you think? I think you're the strongest, most genuine person I've ever met. And I think you deserve better than a life where loving me means living under a microscope. Alexander Hale, Joyce said, standing up and facing him. Do you remember what I told you the first night we had dinner, about collecting vintage postcards? He nodded, confused by the change of subject. I told you I collected them because they were proof that people used to take time to tell someone they were thinking of them, that someone, somewhere, was worth remembering. Joyce moved closer to him. Do you want to know the real reason I collected them? Tell me. Because I was waiting for someone who would make me want to send postcards of my own. Someone who would make me want to say, "Wish you were here," from every beautiful place I might ever visit. Joyce knelt in front of his chair, taking his hands in hers. Alexander, you don't make me want to collect other people's love stories anymore. You make me want to write my own. Alexander's breath caught. Joyce, these last few weeks haven't been about trauma bonding. They've been about discovering that I'm braver than I thought, stronger than I knew, and more capable of love than I ever imagined. Not because of what we've been through, but because of who you are when everything else falls away. Alexander pulled her up onto his lap, holding her close. I love you, he whispered against her hair. I love you so much it terrifies me. Good, Joyce said, pulling back to look at him. Because I love you too, and I want to spend the rest of my life proving to you that you're worth fighting for, worth choosing, worth loving, not because of what you can give me, but because of who you are when you think no one's watching. Alexander kissed her then, soft and desperate and full of promise. When they broke apart, Joyce could see something had shifted in his eyes, the last of his walls finally coming down. Joyce, he said softly, there's something I need to tell you. What? That night we watched the sunrise together? I made a decision. What kind of decision? Alexander reached into his desk drawer, pulling out a small velvet box that made Joyce's heart stop. I decided that if you were brave enough to jump off a cliff for me, I was going to be brave enough to ask you to jump off the rest of them with me. Joyce stared at the box, then at Alexander's face, seeing love and hope and terror all mixed together. Alexander, she whispered, what are you saying? I'm saying that I've spent my entire adult life protecting myself from feeling too much, wanting too much, risking too much. But you've shown me that the biggest risk isn't in loving someone, it's in not loving them enough. He opened the box, revealing a stunning emerald-cut diamond that caught the afternoon light streaming through the windows. Joyce Carter, Alexander said, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. Will you marry me? Will you let me spend the rest of my life learning how to love you the way you deserve to be loved? Joyce looked at this man who had turned his entire world upside down for her, who had faced down reporters and lawyers and public scrutiny just to defend their right to love each other. She thought about her vintage postcards, about all those messages from strangers wishing someone was with them in beautiful places, and she realized she didn't need to wish anymore. Yes, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. Yes, Alexander, I want to go everywhere with you. As he slipped the ring onto her finger, Joyce understood that their story was just beginning. There would be more challenges, more obstacles, more people who would try to tear them apart. But none of that mattered now, because they had something that couldn't be destroyed by gossip columns or federal investigations or anyone else's opinion about what their love should look like. They had each other, and that was worth everything. The engagement ring felt strange on Joyce's finger as she walked into Meridian Tower the next morning. She'd spent an hour that morning in front of the mirror, trying to decide whether to wear it to work. The emerald-cut diamond caught the light in a way that seemed to announce itself, and Joyce wasn't sure she was ready for the attention it would bring. But Alexander had kissed her hand before she left his penthouse, his thumb brushing over the ring, and whispered, "I want the world to know you're mine." The lobby buzzed with the usual morning energy, but Joyce could feel eyes following her as she made her way to the elevators. Winston at the security desk gave her a knowing smile and a thumbs up, making her cheeks warm with happiness and embarrassment. On the 42nd floor, the atmosphere was different than she'd expected. Instead of whispered gossip and sideways glances, her colleagues greeted her with genuine warmth. The news about Genevieve's arrest had apparently shifted how people saw Joyce's relationship with Alexander, from opportunistic scandal to romantic vindication. "Joyce!" Cordelia Mansfield appeared at her elbow as she approached her desk. "Might I have a word?" They stepped into a small conference room, where Cordelia closed the door and turned to face Joyce with an expression that was carefully neutral. "First," Cordelia said, "I want to reiterate my apology from yesterday. I've worked for this company for 27 years, and I've become protective of Mr. Hale in ways that sometimes cloud my judgment. You don't need to apologize again, Cordelia. I understand why you were suspicious. You're very gracious." Cordelia's eyes flicked to Joyce's left hand. "I see congratulations are in order." Joyce felt heat creep up her neck. "We haven't made any official announcements yet." "My dear, a ring like that is an announcement all on its own." Cordelia's expression softened slightly. "Joyce, may I speak frankly?" "Of course. I've watched Alexander Hale build walls around himself for over a decade. After his parents died, after he inherited all this responsibility so young, he learned to trust very few people. The fact that he's chosen to trust you, to love you." Cordelia paused, choosing her words carefully. "It's the first time I've seen him genuinely happy since I've known him." Joyce felt tears prick her eyes. "Thank you for telling me that. But I also want you to know that being engaged to Alexander Hale is going to change your life in ways you might not have considered yet. The scrutiny won't end just because Genevieve is out of the picture. There will always be someone watching, someone looking for weakness or scandal. I know that. Do you?" Cordelia's voice was gentle but serious. "Joyce, yesterday you were a secretary who fell in love with her boss. Today you're the future wife of one of the most powerful men in New York. The difference is more significant than you might realize." Before Joyce could respond, a knock on the conference room door interrupted them. Alexander appeared in the doorway, his eyes immediately finding Joyce's. "Ladies," he said, stepping into the room, "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." "Mr. Hale," Cordelia said smoothly, "I was just welcoming Joyce back and discussing some logistical considerations for her new role here." Alexander's expression sharpened. "What kind of logistical considerations?" Joyce felt tension suddenly fill the room. "Alexander, it's fine. I was just suggesting that perhaps it might be appropriate to discuss Joyce's position here at the company, given recent developments," Cordelia said carefully. Alexander's voice went very quiet, which Joyce had learned was more dangerous than if he'd raised it. "Are you suggesting that Joyce's employment should change because of our engagement? I'm suggesting that having the CEO's fiancée working as his secretary presents certain complexities." Joyce watched this exchange with growing unease. She could see Alexander's protective instincts kicking in, could see Cordelia trying to navigate a conversation that was more minefield than discussion. "What kind of complexities?" Joyce asked. Cordelia looked between them, clearly wishing she'd never started this conversation. "Professional boundaries, public perception, the potential for conflicts of interest." "I see." Alexander's voice was arctic. "And what do you propose we do about these complexities?" Perhaps Joyce might consider a transfer to another department, or a promotion that would put her in a more appropriate position relative to her new status. Joyce felt something cold settle in her stomach. "You're saying I can't keep my job. I'm saying that your job, as it currently exists, might not be sustainable." Alexander stepped closer to Joyce, his presence both protective and possessive. "Cordelia, I think you've said enough. Mr. Hale, I'm only trying to—" "You're trying to solve a problem that doesn't exist," Alexander said firmly. "Joyce is exceptional at her job. She's earned her position through merit, and she'll keep it on the same basis. Our personal relationship doesn't change that." But Joyce could see the doubt in Cordelia's eyes, could see how this looked from the outside. A secretary engaged to the CEO, keeping her job, having access to confidential information, and the boss's ear in ways that other employees didn't. Actually, Joyce said quietly, maybe Cordelia has a point. Both Alexander and Cordelia turned to look at her. Joyce, no, Alexander said immediately. Don't let anyone pressure you into... I'm not being pressured. Joyce looked at him, seeing the fear in his eyes. But Alexander, think about it. How is this going to look to other employees? How is it going to affect my ability to do my job when everyone knows I go home to you every night? Who cares what anyone else thinks? I do. Joyce's voice was soft but firm. I care because I've worked hard to earn respect here. I care because I don't want people to think I got where I am because of who I'm sleeping with. I care because... She paused, the words difficult to say. Because I'm not sure I can be both your secretary and your fiancé without compromising one or both of those roles. Alexander stared at her like she'd slapped him. Joyce, you're talking about giving up your career. I'm talking about changing my career. There's a difference. Is there? You love what you do here. Joyce looked around the conference room, thinking about all the hours she'd spent in this building, all the satisfaction she'd derived from being good at her job, from being needed and valued. I love what I do, she agreed, but I love you more, and I want to build a life with you that doesn't come with built-in conflicts and complications. Cordelia cleared her throat gently. If I may, there might be alternatives. Joyce, your skills are exceptional. There are other divisions within the company, other roles that might utilize your talents without the potential for conflict of interest. Such as? Alexander asked, his voice still tense. The charitable foundation division could use someone with Joyce's organizational skills and people instincts, or perhaps client relations. She has a gift for making people feel valued and heard. Joyce considered this, thinking about the different paths her career could take. Part of her felt like she was giving up something important, but another part felt relieved at the prospect of not having to navigate the complicated dynamics of being both employee and romantic partner. I'd like to think about it, Joyce said finally. Alexander looked like he wanted to argue, but instead he nodded. Whatever you decide, I'll support you. But Joyce, I need you to know that you don't have to change anything for me, or because of me. I know, Joyce said softly. But maybe I want to change some things. Maybe I want to see what other parts of myself I can discover. After Cordelia left them alone in the conference room, Alexander pulled Joyce into his arms. Are you sure about this? He asked, his voice rough with emotion. I don't want you to sacrifice your ambitions for me. Joyce looked up at him, this man who had already shown her more of the world than she'd ever imagined seeing. Alexander, she said gently, my ambition was never just to be a secretary. My ambition was to matter, to contribute something meaningful, to be valued for who I am and what I bring to the world. That doesn't change just because the context changes. But what if you regret it? What if you miss this? Joyce thought about her vintage postcard collection, about all those messages from people exploring new places, taking chances, stepping into unknown territories. Then I'll figure something else out, she said simply. Alexander, loving you doesn't make me smaller or weaker or less ambitious. It makes me braver, brave enough to try new things, to take risks I never would have taken before. Alexander kissed her forehead, holding her close. I love you, Joyce Carter, and I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret choosing me. The rest of our lives, Joyce corrected softly, because this isn't just my choice anymore. It's ours. As they stood there in the quiet conference room, holding each other while the city buzzed with activity below them, Joyce realized that this was what love really looked like. Not just the butterflies and passionate kisses, but the hard conversations and the willingness to change and grow together. She was giving up her job as Alexander's secretary, but she was gaining something infinitely more valuable. A partner who would support her evolution, who would encourage her to become more than either of them had imagined possible. And as she felt the weight of her engagement ring against Alexander's back, Joyce understood that some endings were really just beginnings in disguise. 6 months later, Joyce stood in the bathroom of Rosalinda's restaurant, staring at her reflection and trying to calm her racing heart. Today was the day she'd been both anticipating and dreading, the launch of her new role as Director of Community Outreach for the Hale Foundation. After months of preparation, today she would present her first major initiative to the board of directors, including Alexander's most trusted advisors and several prominent philanthropists who could make or break her credibility in this new world. But that wasn't what had her hands trembling as she applied lipstick for the third time. Hidden in her purse was a small white stick that had changed everything 20 minutes ago. 2 pink lines that meant her life with Alexander was about to become infinitely more complicated and beautiful. She was pregnant. A soft knock on the bathroom door interrupted her spiraling thoughts. "Joyce? Honey? Are you okay in there?" Delphine's voice carried through the door. Joyce opened it to find her best friend holding 2 cups of tea, her nurse's intuition clearly picking up on Joyce's distress. "Del," Joyce whispered, pulling her friend into the small bathroom and closing the door. "I need to tell you something." Delphine took one look at Joyce's face and set down the teacups. "Oh my God, you're pregnant. How did you... You've been queasy for 2 weeks. You ordered ginger ale instead of wine, and you've been to the bathroom 4 times in the last hour." Delphine pulled Joyce into a fierce hug. "Congratulations, Mama." Joyce felt tears spill over. "Del, what am I going to do? Today is supposed to be about proving I can handle this new position. And now," she gestured helplessly at her still flat stomach, "now you're about to prove you can handle anything," Delphine said firmly. "Joyce, you've spent the last 6 months building something incredible. The community centers, the scholarship programs, the small business initiatives. You've changed hundreds of lives already. One positive pregnancy test doesn't erase any of that. But what about Alexander? We've never talked about children. What if he's not ready? What if this changes everything?" Delphine cupped Joyce's face gently. "Honey, that man looked at you like you hung the moon before you were carrying his baby. You think he's going to love you less now?" Before Joyce could respond, another knock echoed through the door. "Joyce?" Alexander's voice was concerned. "The board members are arriving. Are you ready?" Joyce looked at Delphine, who squeezed her hands encouragingly. "Coming," Joyce called out, taking a deep breath and checking her reflection one more time. The main dining room of Rosalinda's had been transformed for the presentation. Benedetta had insisted on hosting the event, claiming that any important announcement involving her Alessandro and his beautiful Joyce needed to happen somewhere with proper food and family atmosphere. As Joyce entered the room, she saw the board members seated around tables adorned with Benedetta's best linens and centerpieces of fresh flowers. Alexander stood near the makeshift presentation area, his eyes immediately finding hers across the room. The love and pride she saw there steadied her racing pulse. "Ladies and gentlemen," Alexander began, his voice carrying easily through the room, "6 months ago, I asked you to trust me when I proposed expanding our foundation's mission. Today, Joyce Carter is going to show you why that trust was well placed." Joyce moved to the front of the room, the small stick in her purse feeling like it weighed 1,000 pounds. But as she looked at the faces before her, some skeptical, some curious, all waiting to see what she'd accomplished, she felt her professional confidence return. "When Alexander first asked me to lead the community outreach division," Joyce began, "I knew I was taking on more than just a new job. I was accepting the responsibility to use privilege and resources to create real, lasting change in communities that have been overlooked for too long." She clicked to her first slide, showing before and after photos of the community center in Crown Heights, where she'd grown up. 6 months ago, this building was abandoned. Today, it serves hot meals to over 200 families a week, provides after-school tutoring to 60 children, and houses a small business incubator that has already helped launch 12 new enterprises. The room was quiet, attentive. Joyce could see Mortimer Ashworth, the Foundation's longest-serving board member, leaning forward with interest. "But this isn't just about buildings or programs," Joyce continued, clicking to a photo of a young girl raising her hand in a classroom. "This is Keisha Williams. 6 months ago, she was failing 4th grade. Today, she's reading at a 6th grade level because she has a safe place to do homework and volunteers who believe in her potential." Joyce moved through her presentation, sharing story after story of lives touched, dreams realized, communities strengthened. With each slide, she could see the skepticism in the room transforming into genuine amazement. "The numbers are impressive," said Lucinda Fairmont, a prominent philanthropist known for her tough questions. "But how do we know this success is sustainable? How do we know you can maintain this level of impact long-term?" It was the question Joyce had been expecting, the one that cut to the heart of every doubt she'd had about her own abilities. "Mrs. Fairmont," Joyce said, meeting the older woman's gaze directly, "sustainability isn't just about funding or programs. It's about creating systems that empower communities to thrive independently. Every initiative we've launched includes training local residents to eventually take leadership roles. We're not just giving help, we're building capacity for communities to help themselves. And what about your own capacity? Asked Harrison Blackwell, another board member. These are significant responsibilities. Are you prepared for the long-term commitment this work requires? Joyce felt the weight of the pregnancy test in her purse, thought about the conversation she still needed to have with Alexander, about the ways her life was about to change. Mr. Blackwell, she said carefully, I've learned that commitment isn't just about what you're willing to give up for something you believe in. It's about what you're willing to grow into. 6 months ago, I was a secretary with good intentions. Today, I'm a woman who's learned that she's capable of much more than she ever imagined. She paused, looking at Alexander, drawing strength from his encouraging smile. And I believe that capacity for growth, for becoming more than we thought possible, is exactly what this work requires. Not perfection, but the willingness to keep evolving, learning, and adapting to serve communities that deserve our best efforts. The room erupted in applause. Joyce could see heads nodding, impressed murmurs exchanged between board members. But it was the expression on Alexander's face that made her chest tight with emotion, pride, love, and something that looked like awe. After the formal presentation ended and board members mingled over Benedetta's famous osso buco, Alexander found Joyce on the small patio behind the restaurant. That was incredible, he said, pulling her into his arms. Joyce, I've never been more proud of anyone in my entire life. Thank you, she whispered against his chest, breathing in the scent that had become home to her. The board is going to approve the expansion of your budget, Alexander continued. Mortimer just told me he's never seen a more compelling case for community investment. Joyce pulled back to look at him, this man who had believed in her potential before she'd even known it existed. Alexander, she said softly, there's something I need to tell you. Something in her tone made his expression shift from celebration to concern. What is it? Joyce, if someone said something to upset you. No, it's not that. Joyce took his hands in hers, feeling the familiar strength and warmth of his fingers. Alexander, how do you feel about children? He blinked, clearly not expecting that question. Children? I've never really thought about it. Why? Joyce's heart hammered against her ribs. Because I'm pregnant. Alexander went very still. For a moment, the only sounds were the distant chatter from inside the restaurant and the hum of evening traffic on the street. Pregnant, he repeated, his voice carefully neutral. About 6 weeks, I think. I just found out today, right before the presentation. Alexander, I know we never planned this. I know the timing is complicated. Joyce, his voice was soft, wondering. Are you okay? How do you feel? The question surprised her. She'd expected concern about timing, about their careers, about the practicalities of a baby. Instead, he was asking about her. Scared, she admitted. Excited. Overwhelmed. All at the same time. Alexander was quiet for a long moment, his hands still holding hers. Then, slowly, a smile began to spread across his face. We're going to have a baby, he said, as if testing the words. We're going to have a baby, Joyce confirmed. Alexander's smile became radiant. He lifted her off her feet, spinning her around the small patio while she laughed and held onto his shoulders. Joyce Carter, he said, setting her down but keeping his arms around her. You continue to amaze me. Today, you proved you can change the world, and now you're telling me we're going to create a life together? Are you happy about this? Happy? Alexander cupped her face in his hands. Joyce, I've been living in black and white my entire life, and you've shown me colors I didn't know existed. The thought of creating a child with you, of watching you become a mother, of building a family together. He kissed her softly. I've never been happier about anything. Joyce felt tears spill over, but for the first time in months, they were purely tears of joy. I love you, she whispered. Even when everything changes, even when life gets complicated, I love you. Everything's going to change, Alexander agreed, his thumb brushing away her tears. But Joyce, the most important thing, us, this love we've built, that's never going to change. That's our foundation, and it's strong enough to support whatever we build on top of it. As they stood there in the gathering dusk, holding each other while the sounds of celebration drifted from inside the restaurant, Joyce realized that this was what happily ever after actually looked like. Not a destination, but a journey. Not perfection, but the willingness to grow together through whatever came next. So, Alexander said softly, what do you think? Ready for the next adventure? Joyce looked at this man who had taught her to be brave, who had shown her that love was worth every risk, who was now offering to explore the greatest unknown territory of all, parenthood, with her. "With you?" she said, standing on her toes to kiss him. "I'm ready for anything." 2 years later, Joyce stood at the window of her office in the renovated brownstone that housed the Hale Foundation, watching her 18-month-old daughter Isla toddle around the small garden below under the watchful eye of Benedetta. The little girl had Alexander's determined grey eyes and Joyce's infectious laugh, and watching her discover the world with fearless curiosity never failed to fill Joyce with wonder. "Mama work?" Isla had asked that morning, pointing to the foundation building as they walked past it on their way to the park. "Mama's work," Joyce had confirmed, lifting her daughter to show her the bronze plaque by the entrance that read, "Joyce Carter Hale Community Foundation, building bridges, changing lives." The foundation had grown beyond anything Joyce had imagined possible. What had started as community outreach had evolved into a comprehensive network of programs spanning education, housing, small business development, and healthcare access. The Crown Heights Center alone now served over 1,000 families, and they'd opened 5 additional locations across Brooklyn and the Bronx. But the work had changed Joyce too. The nervous secretary who had once hidden behind professional boundaries was gone, replaced by a woman who commanded boardrooms with quiet confidence, who spoke at conferences about sustainable community development, who had been featured on the cover of Philanthropist Quarterly as one of 30 under 30 leaders changing urban America. "Knock, knock," came a familiar voice from her office doorway. Joyce turned to see Delphine entering with 2 cups of coffee and her characteristic warm smile. Her best friend now served as the Foundation's Director of Health Services, having left Mount Sinai to join Joyce's mission after seeing the impact they were making. "How did the site visit go?" Joyce asked, accepting the coffee gratefully. "The new Bed-Stuy location is perfect. Close to 3 schools, accessible by public transportation, and the community leaders are already mobilizing volunteers." Delphine settled into the chair across from Joyce's desk. "I swear sometimes I can't believe this is our life now." "What do you mean?" "I mean, remember when you were terrified to order something different at Rosalinda's? Now you're designing programs that are being replicated in cities across the country." Joyce laughed, thinking about how much had changed. The woman who had once collected vintage postcards from places she'd never been had traveled to 12 states in the past year, consulting with other foundations and community organizations about implementing similar programs. "Speaking of which," Delphine continued, "Senator Hawthorne's office called. They want you to testify before the subcommittee on urban development next month. Congressional testimony." Joyce felt a familiar flutter of nerves, but it was excitement now rather than fear. "What's the topic?" "Public-private partnerships in community revitalization. Apparently your model is being considered for federal funding." Before Joyce could respond, the sound of the front door opening echoed through the building, followed by Isla's delighted squeal of "Dada." Joyce's heart did the same little skip it had done for 3 years whenever Alexander arrived. She heard his voice in the garden, probably being subjected to a detailed toddler's explanation of whatever fascinating thing Isla had discovered among Benedetta's flower beds. A few minutes later, Alexander appeared in her doorway, with Isla in his arms, both of them slightly grass-stained and completely happy. "Ladies," he said, nodding to Delphine before his eyes found Joyce's. "How was the morning?" "Productive," Joyce said, standing to greet them. "How was the playground?" "Educational," Alexander replied seriously. "Did you know that slides are more fun when you go down backwards, and that swings can be used for deep, philosophical discussions about whether birds get tired?" Isla reached for Joyce, babbling something that sounded like a detailed report of their adventures. As Joyce settled her daughter on her hip, she caught Alexander watching them both with an expression of pure contentment. "What?" she asked softly. "Nothing. Everything, just—" Alexander moved closer, wrapping his arms around both of them. "Just thinking about how this is exactly what happiness looks like." Delphine cleared her throat gently. "I'm going to head downstairs and check on the after-school program. But Joyce, don't forget you have that conference call with the Oakland Foundation at 3. After Delphine left, Alexander helped Isla down so she could explore the office, which had been thoroughly child-proofed months ago. The little girl immediately gravitated toward the bookshelf, pulling out volumes and reading them aloud in her own special language. "She's going to be just like her mother," Alexander observed, settling into the chair Delphine had vacated. "Curious about everything, determined to understand how the world works." And stubborn like her father, Joyce added, watching Isla attempt to stack books in an increasingly precarious tower. Speaking of stubborn, Alexander said, his tone shifting slightly, I have something to discuss with you. Joyce looked at him, noting the careful way he was choosing his words. What kind of something? The good kind, I hope. Alexander reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out an envelope. This came to the office today. Joyce took the envelope, noting the official seal of the MacArthur Foundation. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it, scanning the letter inside. As she read, her eyes widened. Alexander, she whispered, this is a MacArthur Fellowship, a genius grant. Alexander's voice was soft with pride. Joyce, you've been selected as one of this year's fellows. 5 years of unrestricted funding to continue your work. Joyce stared at the letter, reading it again to make sure she hadn't misunderstood. The MacArthur Fellowship was one of the most prestigious awards in the country, given to individuals who showed exceptional creativity and potential for important future contributions. I can't believe this, she breathed. I can, Alexander said firmly. Joyce, you've changed thousands of lives. You've created a model that's being studied by policy experts and replicated by foundations across the country. You've proven that sustainable community development isn't just possible, it's scalable. Joyce looked up from the letter to find Alexander watching her with eyes full of love and admiration. The nomination letter, he continued, it was signed by community leaders from all 5 of your program sites, 3 mayors, a dozen fellow foundation directors, and, he paused, smiling, Cordelia Mansfield. Cordelia nominated me. Apparently, she's been quietly documenting your work for the past 2 years. Her letter called you a transformative leader, whose vision and execution exceed anything I've witnessed in 30 years of observing social innovation. Joyce felt tears spring to her eyes. Cordelia, who had once questioned her motives and capabilities, had become one of her strongest supporters and most trusted advisors. There's more, Alexander said gently. The Fellowship Committee wants to feature your work in a documentary about innovative approaches to urban development. They want to film here, in the communities you've helped transform. Joyce looked around her office at the photos covering the walls, images of ribbon cuttings at new community centers, children in scholarship programs graduating high school, small business owners cutting ribbons at their grand openings. Each picture told a story of possibility realized, of communities empowered to change their own futures. Joyce, Alexander said softly, 5 years ago you were afraid to order something different at a restaurant. Today you're being recognized as one of the most innovative social entrepreneurs in the country. Do you realize how extraordinary that is? Joyce thought about the woman she'd been, careful, invisible, convinced that her dreams were too big for someone like her. That woman had been brave enough to love Alexander, but she'd never imagined she could be brave enough to change the world. It feels surreal, she admitted. It feels like exactly what was always meant to happen, Alexander countered. Joyce, you didn't become extraordinary when you started this work. You were always extraordinary. You just finally found a stage big enough for your vision. Isla chose that moment to abandon her book tower and climb into Joyce's lap, cuddling against her chest, with the casual trust that only children possess. Joyce held her daughter close, thinking about the world they were building for her. A world where community mattered, where everyone had access to opportunity, where love and determination could overcome any obstacle. Alexander, Joyce said quietly, do you ever wonder what would have happened if we'd been too afraid? If I'd never stayed late that night? If you'd never asked about stopping the race? If we'd let fear win? Alexander considered this, his hand reaching out to stroke Isla's soft hair. Sometimes, he admitted. But then I think about something you told me once. You said that love, when it's real, doesn't ask permission. It just arrives, transforms everything, and never leaves. And I think we were always going to find each other, Joyce. Maybe not in the exact same way, maybe not at the exact same time, but somehow. Because what we have, it's not accident or luck, it's recognition. We recognize something in each other that we'd been searching for our whole lives. Joyce leaned back in her chair, Isla warm and sleepy in her arms, Alexander's love surrounding them both, like a protective embrace. Through her office window, she could see the community garden where teenagers from the youth program were teaching elderly residents how to use smartphones, where young mothers chatted while their children played, where former strangers had become neighbors, and neighbors had become family. I have a confession, Joyce said suddenly. What? I threw away my postcard collection. Alexander raised an eyebrow. When? Last month. I was cleaning out storage boxes, and I found them. All those vintage postcards from places I dreamed of visiting. Messages from people wishing someone was there with them. Joyce smiled, and I realized I didn't need them anymore. Because you're too busy actually traveling to all those places? Because I'm too busy creating places worth staying. Joyce looked at Alexander, at their daughter, at the view of the community they'd helped build. I don't need to collect other people's love stories anymore, Alexander. I'm living my own. Alexander leaned over to kiss her forehead, a gesture so familiar and comforting that Joyce felt tears spring to her eyes again. Joyce Carter Hale, he said softly, you are the most amazing woman I've ever known, and I get to love you for the rest of my life. The rest of our lives, Joyce corrected, just as she had 3 years ago in a conference room that now felt like it belonged to different people entirely. As the afternoon sun streamed through her office window, casting golden light over the family they'd built and the work they'd created, Joyce realized that this was what happily ever after actually looked like. Not a fairy tale ending, but a real-life beginning. Not perfection, but the daily choice to keep growing, keep loving, keep building something beautiful together. And as Isla fell asleep in her arms and Alexander pulled out his laptop to review foundation business, Joyce smiled to herself. She'd finally found her place in the world, not as someone hiding behind careful boundaries, but as someone brave enough to tear them down and build bridges instead. The girl who had once been invisible had become impossible to ignore, and she was just getting started. Sometimes the most beautiful endings are actually beginnings in disguise. When love gives you wings, where will you choose to fly? Your participation in the channel is very important. Please leave your opinion in the comments. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and comment your thoughts. Your participation is very important to us. See you next time.